Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think, and the final part of a three-part series looking at the first ever United Nations Climate Change Annual Report. Part 1 focused on the Paris Agreement itself and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and you can click on that link there to look at that programme. Part 2 looked at the Clean Development Mechanism, the Adaptation Fund and the National Adaptation Plans, which you can get via this link. For this third and final part, we'll look at the social, financial and ecological initiatives outlined in the report, starting with page 17, which looks at the crucial role that women will play in fighting climate change. In the words of Merisaini Vunivaka, the Minister of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation of Fiji, women around the world face some of the gravest risks from our changing climate. That's why women are some of the greatest actors for change and why we need our voices on the front lines of climate diplomacy. At COP23 in 2017, the Gender Action Plan was implemented. The aim of the Gender Action Plan is to ensure that women can influence climate change decisions and that women and men are represented equally in all aspects of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the UNFCCC. The plan sets out 5 priorities. Number 1 is capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication. Number 2, gender balance, participation and women's leadership. Number 3, coherence within the UNFCCC and other agencies of the United Nations. Number 4 is gender responsive implementation and the means of implementation. And number 5, monitoring and reporting. So what does all that mean? Well, priority 1 aims to use workshops, technical assistance and similar learning aids to help developing nations to create gender responsive policies and programs on all their actions. And those countries have to report back on how they've integrated gender equality into all their climate response activities. Priority 2 predominantly promotes the funding of travel to ensure that women can participate in person at the key events and meetings. It also aims to implement training programs targeting women and youth so as to improve how the various UNFCCC processes are implemented around the world. Priority 3 is all about building links and common standards across all the work carried out by the United Nations by training chair people and members of each UNFCCC affiliated body to ensure a proper gender balance. Priority 4 focuses on integrating gender equality and strengthening the capacity of gender mechanisms within a key UN body known as the Standing Committee on Finance. And Priority 5 is an ongoing process of monitoring and reporting, specifically focusing on the impact of climate change on women and men, particularly in indigenous local communities. There's also a feedback path to report on progress towards full gender balance in national climate delegations, as well as a best practice sharing forum. All sounds absolutely right and proper, and although women's organisations have been battling for years and years for just such gender equality programmes, this UNFCCC initiative is still in its very early stages following its inception last November. So I think the best we can say about this one at the moment is watch this space. A vital area of UNFCCC activity since 2005 has been in the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. Turning to page 21 of the report, we get some specifics. Deforestation and forest degradation accounts for approximately 17% of global carbon dioxide emissions, more than the transport sector. RED is an international initiative to reduce these emissions, foster conservation and enhancement of forest carbon stocks, and promote sustainable forest management. In 2005, a system of financial incentives was proposed for the reduction of greenhouse gases stemming from tropical deforestation. The RED initiative was born out of this proposal and updated to RED Plus at COP13 with the addition of a clause relating to the sustainable management of forests, conservation of forest carbon stocks and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. Today the UNFCCC has an interactive website where you can click on each participating country to check out what their activities and achievements have been, and I'll leave a link to that website in the description box below. But as with most of the other UNFCCC initiatives that involve a system of financial incentives, the RED Plus scheme is not without its allegations of corruption. Those of you who watch the programme on palm oil will know about my experience working in Indonesia, and sure enough, that country has attracted attention and criticism, most notably from none other than the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC. Such was their concern that they went to the trouble of researching and compiling a full official report back in 2011 called Preventing the Risk of Corruption in REDD+ in Indonesia. It's an 82-page long document that we won't delve into here except to highlight two extracts from their conclusion. The government of Indonesia is taking steps to curb corruption and money laundering generally, and in the forestry sector specifically, by strengthening legislation and involving independent agencies in monitoring forest-related activities and institutions. Nevertheless, the risk of corruption in REDD+ remains. Efforts to curb corruption are relatively recent in Indonesia, and the nation's legal framework and institutions are still young. Corruption in the REDD+ policy arena is likely to undermine efforts to reduce forest conversion through, for example, manipulating land classification, misclassifying intact forest as degraded land so it can be legally destroyed for commercial purposes, and manipulating land titles. It's also likely to influence the design of new policies and institutions so that corrupt practices can continue under REDD+. If the risks of corruption materialise, it's likely that little long-term land use change will occur and tenure problems will not be addressed. So some significant work still to do there as well. Two other activities came out of COP23 that sit alongside the REDD+ initiative: the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture and the Platform for Indigenous and Local Community Climate Change. They do like their titles, don't they? Back to page 17 for a bit of commentary. Agriculture accounts for 10 to 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's also incredibly vulnerable to climate change. For example, up to 84% of economic impacts of drought are felt within the sector. Over the page, we hear from Johnson Kerda, a climate change activist and indigenous Kichwa of the Ecuadorian Amazon. No, I'm not kidding. We have knowledge to manage forests. We have practices in the highlands bringing plants into different ecosystems. That helps people to adapt. We have a great opportunity with this platform to exchange information from communities. That will help governments to increase their ambitions. And that brings us on to our final point of focus for this programme, the Green Climate Fund. Well, it gets a mention in the report, buried on a rather nondescript page halfway through the document, with the following description. The Green Climate Fund seeks to mobilise private sector investments at scale. In 2017, it shortlisted 30 proposals with the potential to leverage $3 in private capital for every $1 of public funds invested. It seems to be generally accepted that the Green Climate Fund was just really a last-minute compromise thrown together at the end of the disastrous COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009 and hasn't really been properly embraced by many nations. Here's the list of financial commitments that participating countries made at the Copenhagen conference, potentially totaling over $10 billion. And here's what had actually been invested by 2015. President Obama did chuck another $1 billion in just 3 days before he left office, but it looks unlikely that Mr. Trump will be stumping up the other $2 billion anytime soon.
The Green Climate Fund, which is costing the United States a vast fortune.
Here's the Green Climate Fund's own website today, showing the $10.3 billion of commitments versus the actual $3.7 billion handed over. According to the American National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, weather-driven climate disasters just in 2017 cost the United States alone a record $306 billion. That's $100 billion more than the previous record high. So the numbers bumbling around in the Green Climate Fund kind of pale into insignificance by comparison. So what's the conclusion from all the various data that we've looked at in the last 3 programmes? Well, I applaud the UN for taking a lead on dealing with climate change and for putting in place systems and mechanisms for getting all countries involved in mitigating some of the worst consequences of the disasters we're currently facing. But it has to be said that nowhere in the 2018 UN Climate Change Annual Report is there any mention of the urgent need to stop the fossil fuel companies carrying out any further exploration of drilling and mining opportunities, especially in extreme deep sea mining and Arctic exploration, something which by now should be an internationally illegal offence. Nor is there any call to curb the vast and unnecessary excesses of the industrial agriculture companies who, despite the wonderful ideals of the REDD+ system we've just looked at, continue to strip country-sized areas of forestry land every year to graze their cattle and grow soybeans and other crops just to feed them. So it looks like once again human corruption pervades these great initiatives, making it almost impossible to judge whether they're working well or not. Having said all that though, it's surely crucial that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because a system is inefficient or being abused, it doesn't mean that the system itself should be scrapped altogether. Identifying and rectifying flaws and bugs is an integral part of the development of any system, whether it's a mechanical system like a car, an IT system like a gaming program, or an economic and political system like the Paris Accord. Making these changes requires intelligence, wisdom, pragmatism, and humility, which is probably why Donald's chosen to withdraw rather than get involved. That's it for now. I hope this little three-parter has provided some food for thought and maybe even nudged a few people to take some positive action themselves. Thanks for watching and for leaving your thoughts and feedback in the comments section below. It really does mean a lot to receive your views, and I'll always do my best to respond personally to each post. Have a great week, stay cool in this hot weather, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.